welcome to Daily Debrief brought to you by People's Dispatch. You know we love to travel the world with you and today is no different. We'll be talking about Brazil where the election scene is heating up and refugees in Europe who are abandoned by one and all. We'll also look at the US where trade unionism is on the ascendant, especially among teachers. Our first story is from Brazil, which celebrated its 200th Independence Day on Wednesday. But this was not just any holiday coming as it does weeks before a historic election. Needless to say, right-wing Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro was accused of turning the celebrations into a campaign even as his supporters took to the streets with all kinds of exclusionary and divisive messages. Meanwhile, people's movements also took to the streets with a very different focus. Those on the margins, the excluded and the poor. To talk more about these very different visions, we have Prashant with us. So Prashant, can you tell us what did Bolsonaro did yesterday and why is he being criticized for it?
Right, sure. So as we see, like you said, Jair Bolsonaro used this Independence Day celebrations to basically do a campaign event. And this is why he's been heavily criticized by the Workers' Party, which is the main opposition party, by other parties. In fact, some of them have indicated their intention to actually challenge him in the electoral court for what could be some kind of an electoral misdemeanor. Because the Independence Day celebrations are meant to be official functions. And official functions are not supposed to be used to conduct campaign events. And in fact, this is a rule in many countries across the world. You know, ahead of the elections, you cannot use official functions or official moments, make official announcements and use that to your favor. So Bolsonaro did exactly this. In fact, his main rival, Lula da Silva, who's leading in the polls, has actually pointed out the fact that he himself, while he was president, had multiple events of this sort. He never used any of those as a platform for his campaign because Independence Day is supposed to be a moment to bring together people, not divide people. And of course, this is the 200th Independence Day, making it all the more special. And it's also important because the kind of message Bolsonaro delivered and the kind of people who came out in support, the kind of messages they brought together as well, they were the exact opposite of being inclusive. So they were extremely divisive. They talked about, for instance, an anti-communist constitution. They talked about activating the military, bringing the military in. And all this only furthers fears of what has been the Bolsonaro camp's agenda over the past many months. We do know, we talked about this before on the show, that Bolsonaro has consistently created doubts about the election mechanism itself. He said that, it could not be entirely accurate. His supporters have taken this much further. There have been calls into some of the fringe elements for military coups. One of his sons, I think, recently made a call saying that Brazilians armed with guns should join the volunteer corps in support of Bolsonaro. So all this together has created a lot of tension in Brazil itself regarding whether Bolsonaro will follow his friend Trump in terms of trying to overturn the election or not. Of course, he's also made grudging concessions that he'll accept it, but nonetheless, the fact remains that there has been a lot of doubt that he's thrown into the system, really vitiating the atmosphere. So the fact that while he also, of course, dismissed the opinion polls, which show him at quite a disadvantage when compared to Lula. I think the latest numbers show around a 12-point difference. So while Lula may not, according to the polls, may not win in the first round itself on October 2nd, it is likely he may win in the second round according to these polls. So he also cast doubt on that. He's talked about a very kind of divisive message which does not really befit the status of the president of a country which is celebrating its Independence Day. So that is why there has been this barrage of criticism against him. It has been, but let's be clear, it's also in some senses a continuation of what his last campaign was, what the continuation of his campaign so far has been, his entire presidency has been, which is to make extremely provocative and nasty statements, which is to, try to divide people as much as possible, and then try to say, hey, I didn't do all this is not my fault. So that's very much what Bolsonaro is continuing to do.
And Prashant, people's movements also marked something called as the cry of the excluded. Can you tell us what is the significance of this?
Right, so it's interesting to sort of see the Bolsonaro rallies, which are all about, anti this, anti that, a fair element of hatred and violence, sort of violent messaging also, as opposed to what is called the Cry of the Excluded. And the Cry of the Excluded is an annual event which people's movements, including the landless workers movement, that's the MST, organizes. They organize it every year on this occasion, and the focus of this day is actually on feeding the poor. It's a very beautiful idea, the idea that when independence is being celebrated, you focus not on the great stories and the histories, which are of course glorious in their own way, but on the reality of your country, on the reality of your society, that tens of thousands of people are homeless, that I think we have carried an interview with João Paulo Rodrigues from the MST, which Brazil de Fato did. We carried a translation of that, where he talks about the fact that 1 in 4 Brazilians don't have enough to eat. I believe the numbers for Sao Paulo city, where the main event was held for the Cry of the Excluded, there are about over 40,000 people who are homeless. So this is a very interesting vision, which kind of says that you need to keep constantly thinking of the people who are poor, the people who are homeless. So they distribute food, they distribute blankets, for instance. Yesterday was a very cold day, as in Wednesday was a very cold day. It was raining consistently, but still these people's movements got out on the streets and did this work. And this is not some kind of charity work, but this is actually, as far as they're concerned, an essential part of understanding and building and rebuilding the country as far as they're concerned. So a lot of people's movements in Brazil are approaching this election from a very different perspective, and not just as a political, not just an election, a battle of numbers, so to speak, but a battle of visions, of ideas, of a different kind of rebuilding of the country, where they're talking about focusing on the poor, focusing on those who are affected by the pandemic, focusing on the large young population which has kind of lost its jobs, focusing on the indigenous community whose natural the places where they lived, the ecosystems are increasingly being destroyed, focusing on the women and the LGBTQI communities whose rights are also under attack. So these are the agenda of the people's movements and the candidates who support them, and which is why a lot of these movements have also supported for the national presidential election Lula, who sort of brought together a diverse social coalition which comprises a lot of these kind of movements with their very different agendas. So it's very interesting, specifically on a day like this, like Wednesday, on an Independence Day, to see these two very different visions in the same country, within, say, a few 100 kilometers of each other, sort of contesting. And I think it gives you a real sense of what the October elections in Brazil are all about and why they're really important, because this is one of those few elections where that clash has become extremely clear, and which is why it will be important to really sort of watch out for Brazil in the coming months as well. Of course, in addition to the regional implications, there are implications for Latin America, there are implications for the Americas as a whole, for the entire world. There's a lot of that. But internally for Brazil, this is one of the core contradictions which I think really exists right now.
Thank you so much, Prashant, and we'll keep following this very important election. We next go to the Mediterranean Sea, where dozens of refugees were rescued after facing a harrowing 10 days on a sinking boat. The boat got damaged and the migrants were left stranded, but it was only on Tuesday that they were finally rescued. Even more shocking than this delay is the fact that at least 3 children reportedly died over the past many days. How is it even possible that over 60 humans could be allowed to struggle for so long in the open sea? We have with us Abdul for more. Abdul, can you tell us who are these migrants and why were they left abandoned out in the open sea?
Basically, as per the reports, most of the people on the boat were Lebanese and Syrians. We know that there is a war going on in Syria for over a decade now, and a large number of them are already living as refugees in Lebanon. So, and Lebanon is facing an economic crisis. So, the war and the economic crisis basically has added a large number of Syrians have been trying to kind of move out of the conflict zone, move out of their economic misery which they are facing or forced to face, and therefore they're trying to kind of look for destinations where they think they can feel safe economically. So these are the people who were there on the boat, one of the groups, and they were stranded. Why they were left stranded on the boat? Primarily because of the racist anti-refugee policies, anti-migrant policies followed by the European Union, and in this particular case, Italy and Malta. Because the groups which were basically coordinating or trying to convey the message to the authorities to rescue these people for days, they had talked to authorities in Italy, authorities in Malta, asked them to kind of send ships to rescue them. There were many ships in the vicinity as per their claims. None of them moved to save them, despite the fact when the first report, this case was reported last week, no steps were taken, and that led to the death of 3 children, as you rightly pointed out, and there were people desperate who would have died if and that, by the way, the rescue was also not carried out by the government agencies. It was the non-government agencies, the NGOs, their collective effort, which primarily was able to save these people from drowning, from going missing.
Yes, Abdul, so, sections in Europe, they keep talking about how this refugee crisis is like millions of refugees trying to enter Europe from across the world. Is that really the case? And how has Europe responded to this refugee crisis?
Well, that is of course not the case. Majority of the people, as per the data provided by International Organization of Migration, UN human rights agencies and other groups, majority of the people who are displaced for whatever reasons, and most of them are displaced primarily because of the conflict, and the conflict, by the way, are also created by the imperialist interventions carried out by the European countries or other Western, for example, US. So whether it is war in Syria, which created one of the largest refugee crises before the Ukrainian refugee crisis became an issue, war in Iraq, war in Afghanistan, war in Libya, Yemen, wherever you see the economic distress and wars in sub-Saharan Africa, all of them in some way or other created by the imperialist intervention. And of course, Europe is part of that. So even after that, the majority of people who are forced to leave their homes are not going to Europe. They are, for example, majority of the Syrians are living in Turkey or Lebanon. A majority of the Iraqis were migrated to the neighboring countries. Majority of the Afghans are living in Pakistan and other neighboring countries. So this hype that millions of people are coming to Europe is basically an excuse to not accept the people. Many European countries have also quoted the excuse of that coming of refugees creates certain hostilities, which ultimately leads in the rise of right-wing forces there, which is also basically an excuse. What has been the response? If we try to answer that part, if you see, Europe has, instead of taking whatever some hundreds of thousands of refugees which are trying to reach to Europe, instead of taking them in, they have basically invested millions of rupees in funding the groups and organizations which have a very bad record when it comes to taking the sensibilities involved with the migrants and refugees. So whether it is the authorities in Libya, whether it is authorities in other third world countries, UK signing deal with Rwanda recently, all these basically they are ready to invest money somewhere else so that they don't have the responsibility. They have allowed their Frontex, their agency which basically deals with the migrants, Frontex, European agency, has been involved in various cases of torture, killing, beating of migrants who somehow reach the European coast. They have been involved in the so-called measures of pushback, which basically leads to these migrants being stranded in sea for days. As per the UN reports, every year thousands of such people die or go missing in the Mediterranean because of the policies like pushback or torture and other inhuman measures taken by the European agencies. So just to give you a larger picture, from 2014, when the IOM started collecting such data, more than 50,000 people have either died in drowning in this Mediterranean only, or have gone missing. So that basically shows that European policies towards the migrants and refugees is basically based on racism, based on denial, and it's also based on a short-sighted understanding of human rights.
Thank you so much, Abdul, for that important update. And finally, we go to the United States, which marked Labor Day earlier in the week but does not seem to be treating its working people so well. Classes in the city of Seattle were cancelled on Wednesday after teachers voted to go on strike. The teachers have some basic demands: better pay, mental health support, more staff. But administrators seem reluctant to accept them. The teachers of Seattle are just the latest in the sector across the country to go on strike. We have Anish for more on this. So Anish, a few years ago there was this massive wave of strike by teachers in the US, and that's happening again. Can you tell us what's leading to the strike happening now?
Right now, we have to understand that there is a federal stimulus package that have reached school districts. And this is the time when school districts are being asked to increase their spending before these federal stimulus and aids that have come, which amounts to close to about $270 billion US dollars, and across all school districts, not just one, needs to be spent before they expire. And school districts are pretty much on war footing to increase their spending. There are districts that have that have increased their spending by about 20%, more than 20% even. And in such a situation, school districts and the boards, city administrations are not taking teachers seriously. And this is where unions have to come in and have to remind them that the sacrifices that teachers have made are significant, especially during the pandemic. And this is not just educators we're talking about, it's also other parallel staff that have actually also given a lot more than what was asked from them, and what was required of them in their contracts even. Many of them have worked extra hours, have handled larger classrooms. Some of them had to deal with doing away with even caps on classroom sizes. So all of these factors have actually affected US teachers across the country. It's not just Seattle we are talking about. This is happening across the country. And we are already seeing teacher strikes either being taken up in resolutions where an overwhelming number of teachers vote for strikes. Very close to Kent. On the other hand, we have situations like what happened in Kent, which is close to Seattle, where teachers have successfully, secured contracts that are fair to them. And so there are other factors that really need to be taken into consideration as well. We are talking about strikes, as you pointed out, strikes that have been going on for years now. It began in 2020, especially during the pandemic, when teachers were frontline workers, but were not given the same kind of respect or the same kind of consideration as frontline workers who are exposed to a whole host of dangers. But right now, the spending factor really comes into play, and this has actually given them a new opportunity to demand for what is fair to them. And so Seattle is just an example, an illustration of what is happening across the country, and where teachers are either going threatening strikes, or they are securing deals that are fair to them. All of which is, again, to secure deals that are not only fair to them. I have to also add, it is also these deals are supposed to be fair to students as well, because the spending on students are also not something that the school districts are taking into consideration.
Yeah, so Anish, this is happening at a time when labor militancy is at a historic high in the US. We had Strike October, and then there are unions in Starbucks and Amazon now. Do you think the workers are on the move in US?
Definitely, this is definitely a historic moment for workers' movements across the United States. We are not only seeing movements, that are part of a very conventional set of trade unions, but movements that are organizing workers that were never part of trade unions for historic reasons. But right now, they are organizing, as you pointed out, workers like Starbucks workers or workers in Amazons who are not really technically considered employees in several states, are unionizing and organizing for collective bargaining, for higher wages, for fair contracts, for safe working environments. All of these factors, which were often put on the back burner in the US politics for decades now. And so this is definitely a historic moment, and teacher strikes are just part of this. obviously the pandemic has pushed a whole class of workers to come out and demand for their rights to start organizing or reorganizing themselves in ways that can actually help not just them but everybody around them. And the pandemic has actually put that pressure on the working class. And we have to remember that while real wages have fallen in the United States, billionaires have actually increased and have, their wealth has ballooned. And it's not just billionaires, corporates have actually, we have trillion-dollar corporates right now. And this is happening at a time when wages are not increasing or stagnating or even declining in real terms. So these factors have definitely affected workers. We have also seen the legacy of George Floyd protest movement that have actually, taken shape in a very new form of anti-racism movement, have also influenced this working class movement, because a large number of them, again, we should be reminded, are people of color, African Americans, Latin Americans, and so on. So these are people who are not just racial minorities, or not just working class, but also racial minorities. And so that gives an additional, dimension to this that was often overlooked in labor movements and working class militancy in recent time, in the recent few decades we have seen. And now it is coming back in a very new form. So obviously we're looking at a very different kind of labor movement, and it is and the kind of victories that they have secured in the past few years, even the past 1 year we have seen, is actually quite historic on several levels. So yeah, so that's what the situation is right now in the United States. It's something that is new and promising.
Thank you so much, Anish, for being with us on the show today. And that's all we have for today. For more such stories from around the world, keep following www.peoplesdispatch.org and also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.